Your soulmate saying, "Please open this. Before I make the biggest mistake of my life, please open this before you walk away from this moment, before you convince yourself that everything you felt was only in your imagination, before you decide that silence means someone stopped caring, before you close the door completely and tell yourself that you have waited long enough, because something changed last night, not necessarily in the way you expected. Not with some dramatic announcement or a sudden knock at your door. Sometimes the biggest changes begin quietly, inside a person's heart, when nobody else can see them happening, and last night, someone finally had to face a truth they had been avoiding. They thought they could keep running from it. They thought they could bury it under distractions, conversations, responsibilities, pride, and time. They thought enough distance would eventually make the feeling disappear, but instead, the distance made the feeling louder, and when the night became quiet, when there was nothing left to distract them, your memory came back with a force they weren't prepared for. They remembered your words. They remembered your presence. They remembered the way you made them feel understood without demanding that they explain every part of themselves, and suddenly, a thought appeared in their mind that they could not push away. What if I am about to lose the person I was never supposed to take for granted? That question stayed with them. They tried to ignore it. They tried to tell themselves they were being emotional. They tried to find another explanation, but the heart has a strange way of becoming honest when the world becomes quiet, and last night, their heart became honest. They realized that they have been standing at the edge of a decision. One path leads toward comfort, familiarity, and the life they already know. The other path requires courage. It requires honesty. It requires admitting what they feel, and most importantly, it requires them to stop pretending that you don't matter. That is why this message feels different, because somewhere inside this story, there is a person who is afraid of making the biggest mistake of their life. And that mistake may not be choosing the wrong person. It may be failing to choose the person who truly mattered. For a long time, they may have believed that they had unlimited time. They assumed that you would always be there. They assumed another conversation could happen later. Another explanation could come later. Another chance could come later. But something about last night made later feel dangerously uncertain. They began wondering whether you had finally reached the point where you would stop waiting, and that thought shook them, because they suddenly understood something they should have understood much earlier. You were never asking for perfection, you were asking for honesty. You were never demanding that everything become easy overnight. You simply wanted to know whether what existed between you actually meant something, and perhaps they were too afraid to answer. Maybe they were carrying old disappointments. Maybe they had been hurt before. Maybe they didn't trust themselves. Maybe they didn't know how to communicate what was happening inside them. Maybe they thought keeping their emotions hidden would protect both of you. But silence does not always protect people. Sometimes silence creates the very distance people are afraid of, and last night, they finally saw that. They looked back at everything that happened between you, the conversations, the misunderstandings, the moments when one of you reached out and the other pulled away, the moments that seemed insignificant at the time but somehow remained unforgettable. They remembered the little things, a phrase you once said, a look, a laugh, a conversation that ended too quickly, a moment when they wanted to say something important but changed the subject, and then came the realization. Maybe the relationship wasn't difficult because the feeling wasn't real, maybe it was difficult because two people were afraid of what the feeling meant. That realization can change everything, because once someone understands that fear has been controlling their choices, they can no longer blame circumstances for every decision. They have to look inward. They have to ask themselves the question they have avoided for far too long: what am I actually afraid of? Are they afraid of rejection? Are they afraid of vulnerability? Are they afraid of losing control? Are they afraid that you won't feel the same way? Are they afraid that if they finally tell you the truth, everything will change? And perhaps the answer is all of these things. But there is another fear underneath them all. The fear of waking up one day and realizing they had the opportunity to love honestly, but chose fear instead. That is the fear that followed them into the night. And that is why this message begins with those words. Please open this. Not because you owe anyone your attention, not because you are required to wait, not because you should put your life on hold, but because sometimes people need one final moment of honesty before a chapter changes forever, and maybe this is that moment. Think about how strange timing can be. You can spend months thinking nothing is happening, then, suddenly, one conversation changes the entire direction of a story. One realization, one apology, one message, one decision, one brave sentence, and suddenly, everything that seemed frozen begins moving again. That may be what happened last night. Something inside this person shifted. They stopped asking, "How do I avoid this?" and started asking, "How do I stop running from this?" That is a completely different question, because avoidance creates distance, honesty creates possibility, and perhaps they are finally ready to be honest, not necessarily with some perfect speech, not necessarily with dramatic promises. Maybe they simply want to tell you the truth. I missed you. I still think about you. I should have handled things differently. I was scared. I didn't know how to say what I felt. I didn't want to lose you. Those words may have been sitting inside them for longer than you realize, but now they are beginning to understand that unsaid words have consequences. You cannot build a future entirely from thoughts that remain hidden. You cannot repair something without acknowledging what broke. You cannot ask someone to stay while refusing to tell them why they matter. And maybe they know that now. Last night may have forced them to confront the possibility that you could move forward without them. That thought was uncomfortable, but it was also necessary. Because sometimes people don't realize the value of a connection until they understand that the other person has the freedom to walk away. You have your own life, your own dreams, your own future, your own choices, and they know that. Perhaps they once believed your connection was permanent simply because it felt powerful. But now they understand something deeper. Nothing meaningful should be taken for granted. Even strong connections require care. Even deep feelings require communication. Even love needs courage. and this person may finally be learning that lesson. There is something else they realized last night. They don't just miss your presence. They miss the version of themselves that appeared when they were around you, the calmer version. The more honest version, the version that didn't have to pretend, the version that could laugh without thinking about what everyone else expected, the version that felt seen. That may be one of the reasons your memory has been so difficult for them to release. Because you became connected to a part of themselves they couldn't easily replace. People can meet new people. They can have new conversations. They can create new routines. They can stay busy. But sometimes one particular connection leaves an imprint that ordinary distractions cannot erase. And they have discovered that. They may have tried to convince themselves that moving forward meant forgetting. But moving forward doesn't always mean forgetting. Sometimes it means understanding what happened, understanding what you learned, understanding what you want, understanding what you should have said. And perhaps they are finally doing that. They may be replaying moments that once seemed ordinary. Maybe they remember how you encouraged them. Maybe they remember something you said during a difficult time. Maybe they remember the way you listened. Maybe they remember how safe a conversation felt. Maybe they remember an unexpected moment when they realized they cared more than they intended to. That moment may have frightened them, because caring deeply means giving someone the ability to affect you. And not everyone is comfortable with that. Some people would rather appear unaffected than admit they are deeply moved. Some people would rather walk away than risk being rejected. Some people would rather say I don't care than admit I care too much. Perhaps this person has been that way. But last night, something changed. They became tired of pretending. And when a person becomes tired of pretending, honesty becomes almost unavoidable. Maybe they looked at an old message. Maybe they remembered a conversation. Maybe they saw something that reminded them of you. Maybe someone mentioned your name. Maybe nothing external happened at all. Maybe they simply became quiet enough to hear their own thoughts. Whatever caused it, the result was the same. They began thinking about what could happen if they never told you the truth. That possibility hurt more than they expected. They imagined the future. They imagined you moving on. They imagined someone else getting the version of you they once hoped to have close to them. And suddenly they understood the cost of hesitation, not because you belong to them, you don't, but because every person eventually chooses where to place their heart, their time, and their energy, and if they keep waiting forever, they cannot expect life to wait with them. That realization may be why they are thinking about reaching out, but there is a difference between thinking about reaching out and actually doing it. Courage lives in that space between the two. They may type something and delete it, write a sentence and erase it, open your conversation and close it, wonder whether you're awake, wonder whether you would respond, wonder whether too much time has passed. Wonder whether they have already damaged the possibility beyond repair, and then they may ask themselves another question: what if I don't send anything? That question may frighten them even more, because silence is also a decision. Doing nothing is still choosing something, and they may finally understand that. Maybe they are afraid that you will reject them, but perhaps they are more afraid that they will never know. there is a special kind of regret that comes from unanswered questions. What would have happened if I had been honest? What would have happened if I had tried? What would have happened if I had stopped being afraid? Those questions can follow a person for years. And perhaps they don't want those questions to become part of their future, so they are standing at the edge of something, not necessarily a guaranteed reunion, not a magical promise, not a perfect ending, but a chance to tell the truth, and sometimes truth is where healing begins. You may wonder why this matters so much, because perhaps you have been questioning your own experience. Maybe you wondered whether you imagined the connection. Maybe you wondered whether you cared more than they did. Maybe their silence made you doubt everything. But silence doesn't automatically mean absence of feeling. People can be silent for countless reasons: fear, confusion, pride, uncertainty, emotional immaturity, bad timing, a lack of communication skills, or simply not knowing what to do with emotions that feel bigger than their understanding. That doesn't excuse hurtful behavior. It doesn't mean you should accept poor treatment. It doesn't mean you should wait indefinitely. But it can help explain why some stories become complicated. Sometimes two people care and still hurt each other. Sometimes two people miss each other and still remain silent. Sometimes two people want answers and are both afraid to ask the questions. And sometimes one honest conversation can reveal what months of guessing never could. That may be what this person wants. A conversation, a chance, a moment without pretending. They may not know exactly what they will say, but they know what they don't want. They don't want another night of wondering. They don't want to keep imagining different endings. They don't want to keep asking themselves whether they should have tried. They don't want to look back years from now and realize that fear made every decision for them. So if their message comes, don't expect perfection. Expect honesty to be imperfect. Maybe the first sentence will be awkward. Maybe they will not explain everything immediately. Maybe they will struggle to find the right words. That doesn't necessarily mean the feeling isn't real. Sometimes the hardest truths come out in the simplest sentences. I've been thinking about you. I need to tell you something. I know I handled things badly. I don't want to lose the chance to make this right. Those sentences can carry an enormous amount of history, and perhaps that is where this story is heading, not toward a fantasy, toward a conversation, a real conversation between two people who have both changed, because time changes people. You are not exactly who you were when this connection began, neither are they. You have learned things. They have learned things. You have experienced disappointment. They have experienced their own struggles. And maybe the distance between you has taught both of you something that closeness never could. Sometimes people need separation to recognize what they were taking for granted. Sometimes they need silence to understand the value of communication. Sometimes they need to lose certainty before they discover what they truly want, and perhaps that is what happened last night. They discovered what they truly want, but wanting something and being ready for it are different things. That is why you should pay attention not only to words but to actions. If someone says they care, let their behavior show it. If someone apologizes, look for changed behavior. If someone wants another chance, they should understand that rebuilding trust takes time. You don't have to rush. You don't have to abandon your boundaries. You don't have to accept promises simply because they sound beautiful. You can listen. You can think. You can decide. Your heart deserves honesty, but your life deserves stability too. And maybe the greatest transformation in this story is not what they are about to do. Maybe it is what you have become. Perhaps you are no longer the person who waits endlessly for someone else to decide your worth. Perhaps you have learned that you can care about someone without abandoning yourself. You can love someone and still choose peace. You can miss someone and still keep moving forward. You can hope for reconciliation without making your entire future dependent upon it. That is strength. And perhaps they can sense that you have changed. Maybe that is part of what scares them. They may realize that the old version of you would have waited forever, but the person you are becoming understands that love cannot survive on uncertainty alone. Love needs honesty, respect, consistency, effort, and courage. So if they are truly serious, they will have to show you, not just tell you. And perhaps they are finally ready to do exactly that. The words before I make the biggest mistake of my life may sound dramatic, but sometimes a person reaches a point where they recognize the consequences of another choice. They realize that walking away isn't neutral, it changes things. It closes possibilities. It creates memories that cannot always be rewritten, and they may be asking themselves whether they are about to walk away from something meaningful simply because they were afraid to face it. That is a painful realization, but it can also be the beginning of courage. Maybe they have spent too much time thinking about what could go wrong. Now they are beginning to ask what could go right. What if you actually listened? What if you were willing to talk? What if the past could be understood instead of repeated? What if both of you approached the connection differently this time? What if the point was never to return to the past? What if the point was to create something healthier than what existed before? Those questions may be opening a new door. But a door only matters if someone is willing to walk through it, and that is where their next choice becomes important. Will they speak? Will they act? Will they finally stop hiding behind uncertainty? Nobody can answer that for them. But you can answer something for yourself. What do you want? Not what you think destiny demands. Not what someone else expects. Not what fear tells you. What do you genuinely want? Because this story is not only about someone who may be thinking about you. It is also about you discovering what you deserve. You deserve communication that doesn't leave you constantly guessing. You deserve respect. You deserve to feel valued. You deserve someone who is willing to meet you halfway. And if this person wants another opportunity, they need to understand that. Perhaps they are beginning to understand it now. Maybe last night was the moment they realized that your heart is not a waiting room. They cannot disappear whenever they are afraid and expect everything to remain unchanged. They cannot avoid difficult conversations forever. They cannot expect you to carry the emotional weight of the connection alone. If they want something real, they must participate in making it real. And maybe they are ready. Maybe they are preparing the words. Maybe they are gathering courage. Maybe they are wondering how to begin. And perhaps the simplest beginning is the most powerful. Can we talk? For ordinary words, but sometimes 4 ordinary words can open a door that seemed permanently closed, and if that message comes, you don't have to answer immediately. Take a breath, read it carefully, listen to what is actually being said, notice whether there is accountability, notice whether there is respect, notice whether there is pressure. Someone who genuinely cares about you should not need to manipulate you into responding. They should give you room to make your own decision, because real connection does not require force, it requires choice, 2 people choosing each other freely. Again and again, that is much stronger than any dramatic promise. And perhaps that is what this person is finally learning. They don't need a perfect moment. They need an honest one. They don't need to know exactly how everything will end. They need enough courage to take the next right step. Maybe they have been waiting for certainty, but certainty rarely arrives before action. Sometimes clarity comes after you take the first honest step. You talk, you listen, you learn, you decide, then you move forward. Maybe last night was the beginning of that clarity. Maybe they finally saw that their biggest mistake would not be being vulnerable. Their biggest mistake would be refusing to be vulnerable. Because vulnerability can lead to rejection, but silence can lead to permanent regret. And perhaps they are finally willing to risk the first. That doesn't guarantee the outcome, but it changes the story. For the first time, they are not letting fear decide everything.